This is Tim Staten and Stating the Obvious, where we make sense of leadership principles and turn them into relatable everyday actions that could enhance or improve your leadership style. Last week was the first part of a 6-part series on how to build and develop teams. I don't think that I mentioned that it is based on Patrick Lencioni's book, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. I use this model because for me that I have found that these principles are true and can be applied to any team in the workplace. I also have gotten ideas from John Maxwell's 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, which I constantly review and reflect upon my own leadership styles. I say this because it's important for you to know where I'm coming from and where I've been with regards to these topics. Now, last week we talked about trust, and this week we're going to talk about it again. Why? Well, because I think it's that important just to talk about it more than once. I mean, we can't say trust is important if we're not really willing to put our actions behind what trust is. So last week we focused on what trust is and ways to build it. But I don't feel like it was enough, and we need to talk about what trust looks like. You see, a lot of people say you need to build trust, but they don't know what that looks like. As leaders, we need to make sure that we're leading for the right reasons. Leadership is not a reward. It's a privilege, a blessing, it's a burden, and tons of responsibility. It's up to us to ensure that we're doing it for the right reasons. Our employees and people we work with trust that we're leading them for the right reasons. Whether or not it's positional power leadership or if it's peer-to-peer leadership positions. But lately I found myself working more on the peer-to-peer level with people who are willing to listen, and they're actually in positions where they can affect the organization for their greater good, and I try to help influence them in a way to forward the organization for organizational change, because I should better the organization that I'm currently in, and it should be better than when I got there. If I notice that something is off and I don't do anything to fix it, then I'm part of the problem, and that's shame on me. So this is the part where we take a break from this week's topic to say thank you to those who have checked out our podcast. I wanted to share with you that we have hit over 120 independent downloads. That is phenomenal. And I want to thank you all for making that happen. I didn't think 11 weeks ago that was going to get to that, but we are, and it's such a huge number, so I really appreciate it. But I want to see if we can grow that number this week and to see how much that we can share the show and get that out there. So if you could help us out and share the show with 1 or 2 other people who might like it. Another huge thing that you could do to help us out would be to rate us. If you think that we're 5 stars, cool, put that and leave a comment so we can interact with you. Everyone who has left a comment, I have come on the show and I said thank you for your comment. So for the 2 people who have commented, thank you so much. For everybody else who has rated us, I really appreciate your rating as well. And it hugely helps us get our message out to other listeners who may not necessarily know who we are, but when they come up on the new and noteworthy page, it's there. If you have a question though, leave it on our iTunes, our Google Play Store. Our Facebook page is an awesome place to engage and have a conversation, or our Podbean page. If you don't know how to find those pages, I have attached them in the details of the section of this podcast. I recently watched a TED Talk by Harvard Business School professor Frances Frei, and I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, but I think it's Frances Frei, F-R-E-I, and her take on how to build trust. If you haven't seen it, it's a good watch if you got 10 minutes. She talks about the components of trust, in which in her analogy she uses a triad, and the triad is made up of authenticity, logic, and empathy. What she says is that if you are an authentic person in who you are, and you have sound logic that matches who you are, and you genuinely care about people, then they will have trust in you. That sounds simple enough, But if you really think about it for a minute, it's actually harder than you might think. She talks about 3 wobbles that people have, and I found that hard to follow when she did the triangle model. So I applied it to a 3-legged stool. So last week we talked about a chair, and then when you go up to a chair, you don't think twice about it. You pull it out and you sit down. Well, this week we're going to place that chair with a 3-legged stool, with where you sit being trust, and the 3 proportionate legs of that being authenticity, logic, and empathy. So if you think about a 3-legged chair, if one end is longer or shorter than the other, then it has a wobble and it's unstable. So as we talk about it, think of it in those terms. She talks about if you have poor logic or you can't communicate, then you have a logic wobble. She mentions that the most common wobble of trust and instability is the empathy instability, meaning that we as leaders don't put our empathy where it should be when it should be. I can relate to this personally because in my line of work, well, I am, not being the most empathetic person sometimes, but I do try my best to be as empathetic as I can. See, empathy and sympathy are not the same, and people get that confused. Empathy is the ability to understand and share feelings of another person, while sympathy is having those feelings of pity or sorrow for someone else is his misfortune while they're having it. So like you're sharing the same grief that they're sharing. So with empathy, we can project our own feelings, while sympathy, we're sharing in the feelings of somebody else, right? So what we want to do is, let's say, for example, someone's dog has died at the workplace. I can feel their emotion, I can feel the sorrow, and put myself in their shoes and can relate on that level without sharing in the sorrow myself of the lost dog. See, where sympathy is, I would have the same feelings that they would have. With empathy, we can be human without sharing in the emotions, but still acknowledging it's a real thing and that it needs to be addressed, and that, we need to, help those people through those situations at times. I've had to tell people several times while in a foreign country that employees requesting to go home for a grandmother or grandfather or a friend's funeral would not be allowed to go because we were required to maintain a certain level of readiness, and letting them leave would drop us below that readiness level. It's a hard choice to make, and it's a hard decision to make. But in these instances, I could see how trust could have been broken by not showing enough empathy and just telling the person, nah, man, sorry, you can't go, and you're going to have to deal with it. But in showing empathy and dealing with the emotions at the hand and working through the frustration together with the person that we worked with, it helped maintain trust in the leadership and in the organization. I'm not going to lie to you. It's hard. It's very, very hard. But that's why we're leaders, to do the hard things. See, Professor Fry mentioned something that caught me by surprise, but found truth in what she had to say. That if you can find what you are going to allow yourself to be distracted by when people are around you, then that's where you'll find your ability to withhold empathy. Meaning, if I allow my cell phone to interrupt our conversation while we're having it, what I'm really saying is that my technology and my phone is more important than you. And so whatever's going on my phone has more impact on my life and has more to do with things than you do. And so if you apply a situation to that same person that you allowed your technology to interrupt you on, let's say they came to you and you should have shown some empathy, you're more willing to withhold that empathy from that person because you just don't value them that way. So it's not that you don't care, but you need to guard that and really focus on how you can look at empathy and how you can look at where you're going to apply your attention. So you know what? I would say put down your Bluetooth headphones and earpieces, your smartwatches, your cell phones, and look up at the world and be connected with people instead of being connected with a device that's connected to some version of the person that's not real. I find myself in the same dilemma all the time, and I'm constantly telling myself, put my phone somewhere where I don't need to get it when I'm in certain situations because I don't want it to interrupt what that other person is saying. So just think about it. How often do you go to a meeting where everybody is sitting around and they're checking their phones and no one's even talking to each other? It happens all the time, and that's where people just, get disconnected. So I know it's a kind of a random tangent, but it's also food for thought. Now, the second common instability in building trust is the logic wobble, as we mentioned before. Either people lack the ability to have a quality logical decisions or problem-solving skills, or they lack the ability to communicate with others. I think the latter is probably the most common. I know that I struggle with what I'm saying. Is it really getting the point across, and did the person hear what I said correctly? Think about a radio. It's putting out themes and messages and songs, but if the listener doesn't hear it correctly or it doesn't resonate then with the listener, it's just noise. It's just something that's putting out noise. As leaders, we have to be clear on what we communicate and seek clarity in all of our communication. See, it goes towards building trust. There is no such thing as over communicating. I also learned that if you start with the big idea up front and then you back it up with the minutia and the supporting details, it's more effective that way. I read a book a long time ago called Talk Less, Say More. I found that if I keep my communications concise, succinct, and to the point, with the main point and big idea up front and it's clear, that I have a better chance of the recipient of that message getting through to them. I stopped telling myself a long time ago that I worked with adults and that I don't need to over communicate with them and that they're smart enough to get to the point. Instead, I tell myself that they're adults and they have a lot going on in their life, and I have a lot that I have to compete for in their brain space and attention span. Therefore, I must be brief and be rememberable as well. So think about that sometimes when you think, oh, man, this person's just not listening to me. Maybe you're not being rememberable, and maybe you're not competing with the space that they have going on in their head. You're not as important as you may think you are at that specific time, even if you are the leader. Find a way to get their attention, be concise, be complete, and be upfront and to the point. So the last instability that she talked about was the authenticity instability, meaning if you want to be authentic, you have to be you. You can't be anybody else or pretend to be anybody else, and don't be fake. People can tell almost instantly, it's a matter of seconds, that if you're full of crap or not. So don't try to be anything other than who you are. So if you don't know who you are, please figure it out so everybody else can stop guessing. If you know who you are, then be that. Don't try to be that person to fit somebody else's mold of what people think you should be. If you should be more polished, if you should be more rigid, if you should be more professional. Those are just their opinions, but just be you. Because people can view if you are coming off as being authentic and genuine or not. I actually currently have a coworker that I work with, and everyone says, oh, he's rough around the edges and he's unpolished. And he needs to be more polished to work at a certain level in this organization and in other organizations as well. That may be somewhat true, however, but if I'm being completely honest, he is consistent, he is hard, he is slightly unreasonable, but not completely unreasonable, and he'll tell you what he thinks and his truth every single time when you ask it. And I wouldn't trade that type of authenticity for anybody else, because at least I know what I'm getting, and I'm getting him and no other version of him other than who he is. And I really appreciate that. So I recently, on the flip side, had a boss who I thought we had a great working relationship, until it came for us to depart ways and found out that it wasn't what I thought it was. And that broke a lot of trust that I had in the organization and in other organizations that I may work for, because I'm thinking, man, if I thought that, he was genuine and authentic, and I thought something was what it was, but it really wasn't, and he was playing me to get what he wanted, then I felt like, man, I completely misread that. But I also felt used and abused. And when I talked to other people, they felt the exact same way. They felt that they were used and abused as well, because they thought what was genuine turned out not to be genuine. So I can definitely see with this how it would be able to break trust, if you're being authentic and genuine or not. If you think you would be ostracized because you're different, you're a little bit weird, kind of out there, I'm going to offer this up to you. Be you for 30 days and see what happens. Don't pretend to be anything else other than you. 1, you're going to feel better about it. 2, other people are going to feel better about it. And 3, it's going to work out one way or another. And you're going to find out that people will most likely appreciate you more for you being you and authentic than trying to be something else. So with this framework, I found it to be a good way to look at what trust looks like. What are the components of it? How can we measure it or gauge it? Often we use words, but they're intangible and they're hard to define and hard to see what they look like. It's like describing wind. Draw a picture of wind. You can't draw a picture of wind, even though people do. You can draw lines to picture particles in the air and stuff like that. But true wind in itself is colorless, it's odorless, you can't see it, but you can feel it, right? So trust is kind of that way sometimes when people talk about it. You can't see it, you can't paint a picture of it. So how do you trust it? How can you gauge what trust is or take a look at it? Well, this is a measure and a framework to do that. So I hope that helps, kind of give you a way to see what trust looks like. Now, here's also what I'm also going to offer up to you. Take trust and that framework and apply it to the stool again, and then apply it to your life. Where do you want to sit? Metaphorically and physically. Do you want to sit on something that's shaky and not sturdy, or do you want to sit on something that's concrete and solid? I know for me, I can deal with like a legitimate wobbly chair, but after a while, it's going to get annoying and I'm going to get rid of that chair because I want a chair that doesn't wobble. I want a chair where I don't have to continuously mess with it and try to get comfortable with it, right? So don't let that be you as a leader. Don't let people deal with you because you're slightly off or slightly annoying. You're kind of, people can't really figure you out. They deserve better than that, and you deserve better than that. So how do we apply what trust looks like to our everyday life? Well, we can make sense of seeing trust in our everyday lives if we apply the 3-legged stool tool. It's tangible, right? So you know what a stool looks like in 3 legs. You can measure it. It's this long, it's this wide. And you can definitely repeat it, right? So I would say ask people who you trust and you respect and you interact with, and ask them to rate you where you fall on these 3 aspects, and get their candid feedback and make improvements where you need to. Another way is look at your current leadership and those that you follow. See where they fall in this category and how would you rate them. Now, I don't recommend that you tell them this unless they ask this of you, because it could have, some unintended consequences and people may feel a certain type of way about it. But you, for your own personal development, if you look at it and you measure it and you say, they're really authentic, they're really good in their logic, but in their caring and their empathy, they kind of struggle a little bit. So then you can in turn take that and apply it to your own life. And if you're trying to emulate them and some of their leadership styles, you need to say, well, I need to be more caring and empathetic in certain situations so that don't break trust. Versus when you get that feedback, make sure that you tell people, when you get their feedback and you look at the common trends, you could say, okay, I need to focus on my weak areas to even out my stool. So that way I can have a firm, solid ground where people can sit and trust. So, there's nothing new under the sun. Everything that you need is out there. Everybody's thought about something. Everybody's thought of certain topics. It's just a different way that you can probably look at something that you probably didn't look at before. It's hard to do self-evaluation and evaluation of others, if we're going to be honest, but that's why you're leaders and you're choosing to do the hard work. So to recap, the case of trust, you can use the 3-legged stool model of authenticity, logical thought, and empathy, and how you employ those aspects towards problems and people. Now, they're not the same thing. Problems and people are not the same thing. People are people and problems are problems. So address them differently. I know that I'm just saying that and it hit me again. Like, yes, they are different. The people are not the problem. They are people. Look at your authenticity, look at your logical thought, look at your empathy, and see how you are building trust in your organizations and see how you can measure it. So thank you for listening to today's episode of Tim Stating the Obvious, where we talked about building trust in teams and what does trust actually look like. Oh, and please don't forget to subscribe, comment, and share this podcast with 1 or 2 people that might like this show and provide some feedback and help generate a discussion on the subject. I do want to end with this in mind. I am very, very interested in hearing about your stories, your experiences, to keep the discussion going. It's about you and how we can grow and share ideas together. I really hope that you enjoyed this episode and come back for another one. I'm Tim Staten, stating the obvious.